Some housekeeping before I read a very brief statement. Where's the housekeeping?
Here's the unanimous consent.
Yeah.
Members. Here we go.
I expect to have some representatives from Nevada joining us, so I ask unanimous consent that non-committee members, if any, be allowed to participate in today's hearing after the committee members have the opportunity to ask questions, as long as we get out of here by 3:30.
Mr. Chairman, with Mr. Amadei, it's based on his good behavior. I'll just, and I agree. I give consent.
To my knowledge, Mr. Amadeo has never displayed good behavior. We'll keep that in mind. So without objection, non-committee members will be recognized at the appropriate time. Ladies and gentlemen, I call to order this hearing of the Readiness Subcommittee of the Armed Services Committee. Our land-based training ranges are the foundation of military services training and testing capability. They're places where new weapons, tactics, and techniques are tested. They're also places where our service members get vital training prior to being deployed overseas. We're told that even with the advances in simulator and virtual training technology, there's no place for live fire training evolution, no replacement. The associated feedback from range instructors prior to deployment to a combat area is absolutely essential. While the importance of these ranges is paramount, as with every military installations, the services must ensure that the rangers are also good neighbors. Many have asked if readiness and stewardship of the natural and cultural resources are inherently incompatible. The answer is an unequivocal no. Effective communication, relationships, and the use of tools such as integrated natural resource management plans on installation cultural resource managers and early consultations with tribes and other stakeholders will ensure that these ranges meet readiness requirements and remain viable into future generations. This is especially true for the proposed expansion of two of our nation's premier air-to-ground training and testing facilities, the Fallon Range Complex and the Nevada Test and Training Range. Propose significant expansions and have considerable implications for the surrounding communities, including Native Americans. Due to the size and the nature of the expansion, stakeholders ranging from governors to tribal governments to environmental groups, outdoor recreation enthusiasts have all expressed concerns about the proposals. The services must engage in effective communication and with all stakeholders so that their concerns are at least understood and, if possible, addressed. Today's witnesses oversee the processes and the personnel that attempt to balance these equities to ensure that the services maximize readiness while still addressing the concerns of non-military stakeholders. I look forward to hearing their testimonies. With that, I yield to my ranking member and friend, Doug Lamborn of Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that and for having this hearing. I'm going to ask that my full statement be entered into the record without me reciting it. However, I do want to stress that, yes.
Without objection, so ordered.
Okay. Thank you. And there are some definite Natural Resource Committee issues here that we all respect, such as protecting the environment, tribal consultation, energy development, access to hunting, and other kinds of issues. I do want to say that Ranking Member Rob Bishop of that full committee and myself on this subcommittee, and maybe a few others, are on both committees, and we will work, and hopefully there's a great working relationship with them as we go forward on this, because they do have primary jurisdiction on the reservation and expansion issue. However, I want to stress this is a unique public land. There are national security implications for not doing the expansion and withdrawal that I think would be very detrimental. So, yes, let's look at all of the concerns, but to me, first and foremost, there are national security concerns with making sure that both of these ranges are fully functional many, many years into the future. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lamborn. Before I move on from the witnesses, we did receive a letter from Chairman Grijalva We'll put that into the record and make sure that you, all the members, have a copy of that letter. He did point out that, yep, they do have primary jurisdiction in the House Natural Resources Committee. He did also thank us for our work in collaborating with them. He did express concerns about the many facets of the current proposals, including their impact on natural resources and tribal lands. He asked that we continue to work closely with them. We may or may not have a double referral depending upon how well we're able to resolve the issues that are out there. I would hope that we're able to resolve the issues, allow the committee to review, and avoid a double referral. Okay. With that, let's get on with the witnesses. Mr. Jordan Giles, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Army for Energy Installations and Environment. Mr. Todd Mellon, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Energy and Installations and Environment, and Ms. Jennifer Miller, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Energy Installations and Environment. Your formal testimony will be in the record. I suggest you not read the whole thing, but summarize, and we'll move along here. Which one of you would like to start? Army, Navy, do we get to fight that out?
We'll let the oldest go.
The Navy?
The oldest service, that is.
Yeah, okay.
Thanks, sir. So I'll be brief and summarize. Chairman Garamendi, Ranking Member Lambourne, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify on this important topic. It's always an honor to be in front of the subcommittee, and it's always a pleasure to appear alongside my colleagues. Land is the most important resource, or one of the most important resources needed to accomplish Army training. It provides commanders and units maneuver space and weapons range complexes to execute individual, crew, collective, and unit operational training requirements, as well as provide space to conduct programs of instruction for Army institutional locations. For the Army, our ranges are more than just the places that have range in their title. For example, in CONUS, two of our most important ranges are the National Training Center at Fort Irwin, California, and the Joint Readiness Training Center at Fort Polk, Louisiana. And beyond that, then there are all of the training areas around the country where units prepare for events like NTC and JRTC and real-world operations. I'll just reiterate here that to better illustrate that, you all have open invitations to participate in, or, well, probably witness a parachute drop at Fort Bragg, or ride in an armored vehicle in the maneuver lanes at Fort Stewart or Fort Riley, or anything or anywhere else under the Army purview.
I would remind you the committee has taken extensive testimony on rollovers, and we're cautious.
Sir, I understand. The key drivers of Army training land requirements are Department of Defense guidance, notably the National Defense Strategy, and then evolving Joint and Army doctrine, training strategies, and modernization efforts. Based on those, since 2004, the Army has invested approximately $3.5 billion in military construction projects that have modernized, improved, and acquired Army ranges and training lands. That includes the successful acquisition of approximately 275,000 acres of new training land through a planning process that assesses requirements against available land contiguous or near existing Army installations. Most installations were established decades ago, some well over a century ago, at remote locations intentionally selected to minimize impacts to the local community. Today, these communities have grown. Our installations share a special bond with them. Our soldiers and their families contribute to the local economy and attend the local schools. However, the growth of these communities has resulted in an increase of encroachment issues that impact training, but the Army is dedicated to working with the local communities to mitigate encroachment challenges through numerous programs, including the Army Compatible Use Buffer Program and DoD's Readiness and Environment Protection Integration Program. At the installation level, the master planning process at any installation with significant holdings includes an integrated natural resources management plan and an integrated cultural resources management plan. These plans and programs demonstrate the Army's commitment to management strategies that sustain Army readiness while we serve as stewards of natural and cultural resources. So to summarize or to conclude, the readiness is the Army's top priority. Ranges and training land are direct enablers of readiness. We value what we have and strive to be good stewards and good neighbors, while not losing sight of the fact that all this is in support of our mission to provide an operationally ready force. Thank you for the opportunity to present this testimony. Thank you for your continued support of the Army's soldiers, civilians, and families, and I look forward to your questions.
Chairman Garamendi, Ranking Member Lamborn, distinguished members of the Readiness Committee, and other congressional members. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on the Department of the Navy's land-based ranges. The use of land-based ranges is essential for us to meet critical priorities outlined in the National Defense Strategy, which, among other things, requires us to prepare for peer and non-peer competitors. Congress has placed public lands in our custody for this purpose. To ensure we can train on these lands frequently, repeatedly, we protect and manage the natural and cultural resources entrusted to us. We believe that military readiness and good stewardship go hand in hand, and the Department has an excellent track record of balancing these priorities. The Department of the Navy conducts training activities on lands and in designated airspace across the country and in cooperation with many partners, including state governments, tribal governments, and private landowners. In particular, we value the collaboration with the Department of Interior and other federal agencies. In recent years, we have experienced a high level of partnership to balance national security with the needs and goals of our country to manage our natural resources. The importance of our ordnance ranges for naval gunfire, aviation, and combined arms training cannot be overstated. Training in a real-world environment that is representative of current and future weapons capabilities is essential in ensuring our warfighters are fully prepared to survive in combat. While virtual and constructive training is an important element in building warfighter skills, it cannot replicate all the skills that must be honed prior to an actual enemy engagement. Some of these skills can only be obtained through hands-on, realistic training. We recognize frequent and repeated use of live fire ranges has the potential to affect the environment. Those ranges also provide an important habitat for wildlife, including endangered species, and contained important cultural resources. To address this, we consult and partner with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and state and natural resource agencies to prepare and implement robust integrated natural resource management plans. These partnerships have been very effective and beneficial to improving wildlife populations and habitat. With regard to cultural resources, we develop integrated cultural resource management plans in partnership with state historic preservation offices and tribal leadership. We're proud of our efforts to safeguard the many cultural sites on our installations, which includes over 15,000 archaeological sites and over 20,000 historical structures. The Department of the Navy is currently working on several withdrawal actions, of which one is a land withdrawal extension for El Centro Range Complex in California with no change in area or purpose. On another, we are working with the Air Force to extend the withdrawal for the Berry Goldwater Range in Arizona. And lastly, with regard to the Fallon Range Training Complex, we are proposing an extension and expansion of the complex and a change in purpose to include tactical ground mobility training for sea, air, land SEAL teams. In closing, the Department has a proven track record of environmental stewardship and working with our partners. We remain committed to collaborating with state, local, tribal, and federal government agencies to deliver the range capabilities the Department of the Navy requires to meet present and future challenges of our peer and near-peer competitors in a manner that protects natural and cultural resources. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Ms. Miller.
Chairman Garamendi, Ranking Member Lamborn, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, it is an honor to represent airmen and senior Air Force leaders today. My full written statement has been submitted for the record. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss this topic vital to military readiness and national military strategy. the withdrawal, extension, and expansion of the Nevada Test and Training Range, or NTR. The Air Force understands that we are temporary stewards of the NTR and take seriously that responsibility with which we are entrusted. It is through that lens that we look forward to discussing proposals to meet our expanding requirements while preserving this land for future generations. The Air Force is currently working to withdraw 2 ranges, the NTR and the Barry M. Goldwater Range just mentioned, or BMGR in Arizona. We plan to use some of the best practices from the BMGR as the basis for the upcoming NTR renewal. The NTR is the crown jewel in Air Force test and training. It is the best location in the world to train our warfighters. Only at the NTR can we integrate all aspects of air warfare in a manner similar to what our airmen will see in real combat. This is due to 2 factors: the sheer size and remoteness of the NTR and the huge $8 billion range infrastructure. We maximize this NTR investment with between 16 and 24-hour-a-day operations. The NTR cannot be replicated elsewhere. The NTR is over capacity. Without an expansion, the NTR will fail to meet military training requirements. This extension can increase its capacity by up to 30%. 5 years ago, we began the process of developing a legislative environmental impact statement, or LEIS, for the NTR withdrawal renewal. We use that process to balance mission requirements with minimal impacts to the public, environment, and the taxpayer. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Bureau of Land Management, Department of Energy, Nevada Department of Wildlife, and the Nevada Association of Counties were all formal cooperating agencies in this effort, as were 17 local tribes through the consolidated group of tribes and organizations. The Air Force has worked extensively with these and other stakeholders over several years to develop a proposal with almost no impact to the land or species. The proposal would restrict public access to some areas, but only fairly limited. The NTR currently has an 842,000-acre overlap with a Desert National Wildlife Refuge, or the DNWR. We propose to expand this overlap by an additional 284,000 acres to provide public protection for the increased size of the new weapons safety footprints. It is important to note we are not proposing to primary use of this expansion is for this public safety buffer. It would leave the lands virtually untouched and pristine. To increase the capacity and realism required for the high-end fight and modern military mission, the Air Force is proposing to allow low-impact ground access in the overlapping portions of the DNWR. However, in total, we plan to disturb less than 35 acres of that potential expansion. This minor disturbance is limited to emplacing up to 15 equipment pads, maintaining the existing roads, using a dry lake bed to drop off small Special Forces teams for use in the area. Under the current Fish and Wildlife Service restrictions, the military cannot conduct this critical mission training in the DNWR. Extensive environmental and cultural resource programs for the NTR. We will not programs. The Fish and Wildlife Service does not currently spend money to manage the DNWR overlapping area. Instead, the Air Force manages these lands in accordance with the Sykes Act and through integrated natural and cultural resources management plans. The Air Force spends, on average, over $3.5 million annually on the environmental and a collaborative multi-year public process weighing military requirements and other federal, state, private, and public interests. The Air Force modified our proposals based on requests that we received throughout the LEIS process. We reduced the proposed expansions to support identified recreational activities. We will continue to enable the Bighorn and local tribal access. Finally, the Air Force will support a public access program through the cooperative development of an access management plan with significant public input. Thank you for inviting me to appear today and for your continued support of our airmen. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you much. Thank you very much, Ms. Miller. I note the arrival of Mr. Amadei. Thank you. We had an extensive meeting with both the Navy and the Air Force with regard to their proposals. Going forward, I believe it entirely possible that we can accommodate the multiple needs of both the military as well as surrounding community and other interest groups. It's going to take additional discussions. and specificity as to exactly what the military needs to do and where they need to do it, as well as what disturbances or activities that occur in the key parts of the ranges that would make it difficult or impossible for the military to carry out its task either in either of these two, Fallon and National Test Training Range. Final point I want to make is that there are solutions to these questions, and we intend to hear from the members of the committee about concerns that they may have specifically about these two that are on the table today, Fallon and the Nevada Test and Training Range. There are other facilities that members may be interested in, and when they have a chance to talk, they should take that. Mr. Lamborn, turn it over to you.
Thank you. Ms. Miller, thanks for being here. Thank you all for being here and what you do for our country. In your written testimony, you highlighted that the Nevada Test Range could not accommodate some program requests due to physical capacity constraints. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Yes, sir. So right now, even with operating many days up to 24 hours a day, the Nevada Test and Training Range does have limitations. We are turning away right now 16% of the programs requested to be flown on the knitter that we just cannot accommodate with capacity. Each of those programs can involve hundreds of flights. So you're talking about hundreds of sorties, and 16% of those we've not been able to accommodate. We believe with the expansion of the southern range for the NTTR, we could increase capacity by up to 30%, moving some of those missions that we can now only perform in the northwest end of the range down to be able to perform those in the south.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Mellon, on a similar vein, it seems counterintuitive at Fallon that we're using precision-guided munitions and wanting to expand that use, but that requires a larger complex, although more targeted munitions. Can you explain what's going on there?
Yes, sir. While they are much more accurate and higher technology compared with many of our what we would consider gravity bombs, the difference really has to do with the delivery mode. Due to the size constraints on the Fallon ranges today, a typical strike mission for an air-to-ground integrated attack would occur at altitudes of about 10 to 12,000 feet, and they would be dropping ordnance from about 2 to 4 miles from the target. That is not at all representative of the current operational environment, nor is it representative of the altitude and distances we would actually employ for weapons that we use today. Those altitudes change to closer to 30,000 feet. The speed you deliver goes from about 300 knots to about 600 knots. And the distance from target goes from that 2 to 4 miles I was discussing to 10 to 12 miles. So while the weapon itself is fundamentally more accurate, the issue becomes that safety area surrounding that should there be a mechanical failure of the weapon or the weapon's guidance system itself. It is really from a safety perspective, should there be something that happens with the weapon or something that happens in the procedure to provide that additional buffer. The other point I'll make is our new weapon systems, in particular the F-35, bring with it a different and higher power targeting device in their EOTS and laser system. And with that, there's a larger safety zone associated with what's called stray laser energy. So in order to protect the public from that laser targeting system, those areas have to be larger as well. So that's fundamentally the reason behind it.
Okay, thank you very much. And my last question is for Mr. Gillis from the Army perspective. You did mention in your, I believe, written testimony, the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, and one thing that it did is it let the Army identify public opposition to acquisition land down at Pinyon Canyon Maneuver Site, which people at Fort Carson, which is in my district, go to train at, although that's in another congressional district. There's an issue now at Pinyon Canyon having to do with a natural gas pipeline that goes right through the middle of it. And that restricts the ability to use live fire exercises, unless you want a potential huge natural gas explosion. So if live fire were added to the Pinyon Canyon repertoire, would that help readiness? And what is the Army doing to look at solving the problem of the pipeline so that that readiness could be enhanced?
So short answer, yes, sir, that would help, and that would broaden the training that we can do at Pinyon Canyon. To be fair, though, the pipeline was there when we acquired the property, so we can't be too indignant about it. What we'd like to do, though, is work with the community and work with the pipeline owners to get to a solution that would potentially help us move the pipeline. I think there are two ways to look at it. There was an accident out there not related to Army training where natural gas had to be routed around part of the pipeline that goes through the training area. And as far as I know, that didn't disrupt supply. So I think that there's a way to work it. And then there may be a way to work whatever recapitalization is required to address the issues that caused the accident with the pipeline. We'd like to be able to work with the community to leverage that to see if there's a way to reroute the pipeline when the capital improvements are made.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lamborn. Ms. Torres-Small, you're next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And
We're going to, excuse me for a moment, we're going to go to the 5-minute clock, and so thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a few quick questions. One, for the Fallon range, I noted that there's the private transactions. If you are purchasing private land, would that acquired land then be taken into the PILT and SRS formulas for reimbursement to compensate for local taxes impacted?
I think we're working through that process. It's certainly under consideration from a Navy perspective. We continue to work through the details of that with the county governments on how we're going to approach that. Many of the lands we're talking about purchasing are actually state-owned. They're not necessarily private land ownership, but that is certainly something we're willing to work with.
And is there any tribal land that would be impacted, whether it's in fee or trust or allotment?
There's no direct impact on tribal lands. I think the big issue with most of the tribal leadership has been cultural resource and resource access.
That's great. That's my next question. I was pleased to hear Ms. Miller speaking when it comes to the Nevada, the NITR, the consultation that's happened there. Can you just briefly describe the consultation process that you've had?
Yeah, we've been in ongoing consultation for the last 2 to 3 years with local tribal governments. I think part of the challenge has been the consistency of that engagement, and I don't mean consistency in terms of frequency, but it's more consistency of representation and level of representation. I think it wasn't apparent to me until mid last year that there was an expectation of more senior leadership engagement from the Department of the Navy as part of that consultation process.
I think that's one of the challenges with government-to-government consultation is expecting the highest levels for negotiation.
Yeah, and we had a bit of that. Actually, we just had a meeting out there 2 weeks ago. And part of the discussion we had is from a Department of the Navy perspective, our most senior local representation is that base commander. So from a department perspective, when our base commander goes, he is senior Navy leadership. I'm not certain that's always recognized the same way. And that we've had good discussions about that, and we've fundamentally changed that level of engagement. I've been actively engaged since September, October of last year and participated in 4 or 5 separate meetings with tribal leadership. I
deeply appreciate that, and I hope that continues. Relatedly, I know that you're looking at acquiring new land. At White Sands Missile Range, which is in the district that I represent, they have a different formula of call-up areas. So where they're planning to use that land, they have a existing contract with the private landowners that will change kind of access. Is that a model that you've looked into?
It is not a model we've looked into. Most of the lands we're talking about acquiring are associated with a range called B20, which is the northwestern corner of the property. And if you look at that, that's actually a checkerboard. When you look at it, it's checkerboard. So the quote-unquote private lands or non-governmental lands are actually intermixed amongst a checkerboard of federally controlled properties. So I think those kinds of things would be difficult but I don't know that they're impossible. It hasn't been proposed as an alternative from anybody from Nevada, at least to my knowledge. None of the meetings I've been in, we haven't had any opposition to our proposal to go forward with the acquisition of those properties.
Well, I mentioned it specifically in relation to the challenges with tribal consultation. If it's about cultural access, if there's instead it's notifying when that land will be in use as opposed to acquiring all of that land.
Oh, I'm sorry. I misunderstood your question. We are actually proposing a full access management approach for all cultural resources on the ranges. I think the question becomes, how do you manage that? What is that level of access? And we are actively engaged and want to continue to be engaged with the tribes to develop that plan.
Right. And just because I have 40
Yes.
seconds left, Ms. Miller, same question for you. Have you considered the call-up model as an alternative to your preferred alternative?
So we've been very open with our current cultural management plan, working extensively with the tribes and have met with them. In fact, our Appendix K that we submitted with the Legislative Environmental Impact Statement was written by the tribes. Yeah.
Yes, and I apologize specifically about the call-up model, and perhaps for you it would be more relevant in terms of the wildlife range.
Right. So there's no private property involved here, but here it's all federal land right now. So we would continue to allow access for the cultural resources, and are happy to continue to work with the tribes to the maximum extent we can.
Thank you. I yield the remainder of my time.
Thank you. Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I yield my time, Mr. Gillis, I understand you're from Georgia. Did a little time at Fort Stewart. Third ID, I assume. Thank you for your and we just want to say hello and thank you for your service. And when you get done at Washington, I hope you'll move back. Certainly, we had hoped that you would select Fort Benning instead of some lesser base in Kentucky this past week. But with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield the remainder of my time to Mr. Amidei.
I would prefer not to do that. The rules of the committee being what they are, we're going to take committee members first.
Okay, well, then I'll ask my questions.
And our friend from Nevada.
Well, then I have questions.
Go for your questions.
But since we were talking about it,
I will have an opportunity momentarily.
since we were talking about his state, I thought I would yield to him. So the range expansions support full operational tests and evaluation of future munitions.
Excuse me, Mr. Scott.
Sir.
The keeper of the rules just tapped me on the shoulders and said, Mr. Chairman, you're wrong.
I knew you were wrong, but I didn't want to argue with the chair. Mr. Amidei, that means you have 3 minutes and 40 seconds.
I think the chairman's right.
We'll restore the time. You've got 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for letting anybody, regardless of pedigree, sit in on the committee meeting today. Mr. Ranking Member, I know the decision is provisional, so I will attempt to behave as the committee is used to from its regular members. Mrs. Miller, how's things going with the Fish and Wildlife and all the folks on the sheep?
Particular to the bighorn sheep, there will be no impact as a result of this proposal. So we've worked very effectively with them on this LEIS with the bighorn sheep.
Let me rephrase that then. Is anybody from Fish and Wildlife or any wildlife groups going to show up when Chairman Garamendi opens the hearings up? And are they going to show up and say, we love what the Air Force did and everything's going to be fine?
Sir, I would say probably not.
Okay.
We have worked extensively with Fish and Wildlife. We were able to share our draft legislative environmental impact statement with them and incorporated all 100% of their requests up through the Department of Interior to the current version that's with the Office of Management and Budget. We're also open to, and they had recommended a number of things, even up to including to the extent that we don't live up to our obligations laid out with the Access Management Plan, that we would lose access to the withdrawal, and we'll continue to work with them.
Okay, great.
Sir.
Has the Air Force evaluated, or do they have any position with whether or not amendments to the Southern Nevada Public Lands Management Act are okay once your bill gets to Congress in terms of trying to deal holistically with Clark County? Is that something you folks have thought about at all or care about? Or?
Yes, sir. So the challenge is that the legislation passed in Nevada, we were not able to consult in advance of that. We will continue to work with Nevada locally and Fish and Wildlife nationally and locally to try to come up with a consensus type language for the withdrawal, sir.
Okay, great. Thank you. Mr. Mellon, first of all, thank you for what the Navy's done in terms of being responsive, and I'm not picking on the Air Force, it's just that since you're kind of in the middle of my district, your folks have been very responsive. That's not something that we take for granted, and I want to thank you for that. And I know that there's a lot of moving parts in that, but being absent from the discussion or being hard to get a hold of is not one of them. So thank you and to your staff for that. Moving on to maybe what some of the stuff that my colleague from New Mexico alluded to the extent that impact areas are going to increase, even though the munitions are much more precision, is it in your plan right now that before you start, and these are my words, nobody else's, bombing new areas, that those are going to be cleared for all cultural resource purposes?
Yes, sir, Congressman. As a matter of fact, all of the proposed target sites for the new range expansion have all had 100% pedestrian surveys done on them. So any of the proposed new target sites, we've already done those pedestrian surveys, and we are positioned to go further based on further consultation with the tribes as we work through both those target sites and additional surveys beyond that. We're in the process of kicking off a study with them, which is going to drive us towards additional studies that will need to be done before those ranges go operational.
Okay, thank you, and I'll yield back what little time I have left.
No, you actually have another minute.
Okay, then I won't yield it back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Mellon, the Fallon Paiute Shoshone folks have got some concerns about stuff within the existing boundaries of the base in terms of historical practices. Any thoughts on how to remediate that, make that pot right, address those concerns?
Yeah, so we're moving forward with a couple of different things. First of all, we're in the process of hiring a full-time tribal liaison on the staff for NAS Fallon. Today, we've got a community liaison, so it's beyond just tribal liaison, and then it's the skipper of the base. We want a full-time individual whose pure focus is working those relationships with local tribes to ensure we're doing the things in their best interests. Secondly, for access to cultural resources, we want to work with them on a cultural resource management plan and strategy, as well as an access program. And we actually want to hire tribal representation as part of that access program to essentially facilitate that access, help us manage those schedules when the ranges aren't in use.
Same kind of answer for the folks in the Walker River Paiute tribe?
Yes, sir.
There's some pre-existing issues as well as going forward, so I'm not going to think that they're taken care of, but that's ongoing between now and as we go through the process further.
Yes, sir. I actually met with Walker River about 2 weeks ago. We've put an idea on the table for them. We've got some more work to do with DOI and some other entities, but I think we've actually got a little bit of a path forward to help resolve some of those old off-range ordinance issues with Walker River.
Okay, great. Now I would like you to...
No, at this time...
I would like to yield back, Mr.
Thank
Chairman.
you. Appreciate that. As does Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop, you're next.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Mellon, let me ask you a couple of questions. Goldwater Range. I understand that you're not talking about expanding the footprint of that, just using the same area, same mission, same everything else. If that were, and that's up in 2024, right?
That's correct.
So if that were to be extended in some way just for the existing range, existing conditions, everything else, if the NDAA were to extend that, how much would that save the Air Force, or how much would that save the Navy?
I'll defer the cost estimate for the LEIS to the Air Force. The Air Force has actually done the full budget for the LEIS. From a Department of the Navy perspective, we believe our current resource management, our cultural management approach, the custodial care we've done for those ranges has put us in a good position. I think the one thing we lose as part of that is that good community engagement as part of the process. I don't know that should necessarily drive us to an LEIS. But I'm not certain that lack of community engagement as part of the extension shouldn't be accommodated.
There's a cost. Ms. Miller, what would the cost be?
Sir, the cost for the NTTR LEIS is $13 million. That did include an expansion, so consideration, so you can anticipate that it would be less than that.
Do you have one for Goldwater if you're not talking about expansions, just renewal?
It would be much smaller, sir, but I don't have the number. I'll have to get back to you that.
Okay, I would guess half. In years past, it's about a $7 million cost for over several years if you're just doing a simple renewal. So it sounds like you're back in the same ballpark. If on Fallon or Nellis, could you explain, if your proposal were to go through, how would the desert habitat management be changed if Congress were to support your position?
Sir, so we have a map that shows the hashed area. I don't know if you have that in front of you. It's somewhat of a helpful reference because it shows that there's already a significant area between our range and the DNWR. Our proposal is that if there was an extension, that it would be into that same DNWR area. What we would like is to have some of the restrictions removed that currently don't allow us to do anything outside of the small box impact areas and the smaller areas on the withdrawn land. So our proposal would be to enable certain things such as a landing on a small dry lake bed, special ops type and land overwatch navigation, irregular warfare type operations outside the current boxed area.
So using Amadee's words, like you're not going to really bomb other areas. If you take on that habitat responsibility, that's an additional task for the military to deal with. Why would you want to expand to do that? I mean, what you're really after here?
Yes, sir. So it's less the management of the land that's of interest to the Air Force and more the operations that we can perform on the land.
So you're talking about the need for a buffer?
Sir, there's two things. So to the east, the area that's hashed in pink on the map is an area that's a weapons safety footprint. That allows us to do more realistic training. So that really is more of a buffer. The area in the current DNWR that we would like to, irrespective of the management of that, but to provide it, to be able to perform additional operations in, would be to be able to go out there at all. Right now, other than recreation and species management, the Fish and Wildlife does not permit the Air Force to go out into that area for any military operations because it's treated as though it's wilderness area. That's the way that Fish and Wildlife currently treat it. It's been designated as wilderness study area since 1974, so they're treating it as though it's wilderness area. We cannot perform any military operations in that area, and under no circumstances are we recommending an additional impact area.
So the reason, if I'm hearing this correctly based on other stuff that we have, the reason that ranges, not just the ones you're talking about, but real ranges like Uter, the reason those ranges need additional space is primarily because of the 5th generation equipment that we now have. You're not going to bomb more area, but you just need more space to get the work done.
Right now, we can't train like we fight. We're unable to put emitters out in the area to the east of the range. What that means is that right now, after our pilots fight through the enemy, the red team, they would typically then have the enemy IADs there that the emitters. And so what we'd like to do is put these footprints down, these up to 15 dirt footprints where we could do these mobile emitters to put them out there to simulate the enemy. Right now, additionally, without the weapons safety footprint, our pilots have to say, I would release now. They continue flying at a different elevation, different range, and then they're able to release their weapons. It's not realistic combat training.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Bishop. Ms. Stefanik.
Thank you. Mr. Gillis, I wanted to touch on a few issues related to Fort Drum. First, I wanted to highlight the recent victory we had locally with the continuation of the re-energy contract with Fort Drum. As you know, Fort Drum is the only Army installation that's 100% renewable energy. It's energy secure, it's energy independent, and for our viewers and the members in the audience today, this is a biomass facility and it creates many, many local jobs. So having that certainty, I think, is really important for the base. That's a comment. My question related to Fort Drum is, as a part of the Integrated Natural Resources Management Plan, Fort Drum is actually the largest Fish and Wildlife Management Act cooperative hunting area in the entire state. So as the ranges and capabilities of weapons increase, what is the impact of that on the cooperative hunting areas like the one we have on Fort Drum?
Thanks for the question. So it really varies by installation. And what we've seen really across the board is that we've been able to maintain that partnership and that access to the land for hunting And it's not just the community that takes advantage of it, but soldiers and their families do as well. So it's important for us to maintain that capability, and we seek to do that wherever we can.
Absolutely. It's we have many avid sportsmen in my district, and that's really, really important. And Fort Drum really is the model when it comes to the community support for the base. It's something that we take very seriously and we're very proud of. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. Having completed all of the members, Mr. Amadeo, if you'd like to ask another question, it's 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Wait, Mr. Chairman, does that mean we have to listen to him? Oh, okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I would note the presence of the Dean of the West, and just what a privilege it is to be sitting on the dais below the Dean of the West, for the record. Mr. Mellon, I appreciate the fact that you guys have got to get the bill out of the Pentagon first before it comes up here. And I think you guys know what I'm talking about in terms of some concerns, whether it's folks whose agricultural impacts are going to be ones that perhaps your lawyers, and no offense to your lawyers, and I realize that the young lady from the Air Force is a former JAG officer too, so no offense intended. But it's like in terms of doing the right thing by folks who are going to be displaced, even if there is not statutory authority, as long as those, theoretically, as long as trying to make the pot right for some of those folks doesn't involve operational objectives for the Navy in this expansion, I mean, is that something that I would assume would be looked at with an open mind if we're not talking about operations?
Sir, it absolutely is something we're looking at with an open mind. So everything from mining claims and how we adjudicate or mine out certain claims. We've worked with Bell Mountain on a proposal they had on how we can change the survey actually for a particular area of B-17 to accommodate their mining. We've got a proposal from them. It's in evaluation. We believe we can make it work. Similarly, for grazing permits and the impact of loss of grazing permits for some of those cattle ranchers, we've developed a valuation process. We believe that looks at it more holistically. And we've got a methodology that we believe is going to be fair and reasonable that we've made available to the public.
Okay, thank you. How's things going with Churchill County?
We continue to make progress with Churchill County. They've still got a handful of sticking points. We just got the state's consolidated position back that came in late Monday or early yesterday. Our team is still working through that. I've got a meeting set up with Churchill County representation when they're in town at the end of March, the end of February, early March. So I'm going to sit down and meet with them. We're going over to their spaces here, and we're going to talk about where their proposal is. My team will have our review done. We've got a couple of sticking points I think that are going to be hard. Probably the hardest one is going to be access to Pole Line Road and continued access for that. I think the rest of them we can come to resolution on in one way, shape, or form. I don't know that either side is going to get 100% of what they want.
Okay. As far as, since we're talking around 600,000 acres, and a lot of that is the way you folks fight these days in terms of not looking down and hitting and pickling the ordnance off the airframe and stuff like that. Do you have an idea of, because a lot of things, whether they're Native American, whether they're the state's concerns, Churchill County concerns, like, okay, so you need 600,000 additional acres to train in the way you fight. And I know that you don't need them because you're going to need that once every 3 weeks or something like that. But do you feel like in terms of providing access in those times for those things that are very important to those state and local governments, is access, how would you describe your present plan as far as access for other folks who have traditionally had access to the land for municipal or other sorts of needs?
Yeah,
tribal?
so one thing I want to, so the additional withdrawal or acquisition of the 600,000 acres, almost half of that is related to Dixie Valley and the expansion of the Dixie Valley range. The Department of the Navy is proposing no change in access to those withdrawals associated with Dixie Valley. And in fact, those would continue to be managed by BLM in the process. The only thing the department is looking for associated with Dixie Valley is the management of lighting and associated lighting resources for any future development, as well as an ability to monitor and control the electromagnetic environment in that region. So as an example, if a developer were to come in and say they wanted to put 5G in the area.
I don't mean to cut you off.
Yes, sir.
But I'm about to get cut off. So all I'm going to say is this. Be careful what you ask for, because what you're asking for has sage hen habitat on it, needs fuels reduction for fires if you're going to be a good neighbor, and the ever-present wild horse. So I'll be looking forward to seeing what the plans are for your stewardship in those areas, among others. Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Amedee, for joining us. Ms. Holland?
Thank you, Chairman, and good afternoon, and thank you all so much for being here today. Assistant Secretary Mellon, I want to start off with a few questions to make sure I follow the process here. In a few weeks, the Navy plans to submit a request to Congress for legislative action on a land withdrawal at the Fallon Range Training Complex. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am, it is.
And that request is pursuant to the end of a 20-year withdrawal, last authorized by Congress in the 1999 NDAA. Is that correct?
That is correct. Ma'am, if I want to clarify, OMB will actually submit that legislative proposal.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. It's also my understanding that the Navy plans to request in that package that an additional 660,000 acres be withdrawn in order to meet readiness needs. Is that correct?
About 600,000 acres would be withdrawn. About 60,000 acres would be purchased.
Okay, thank you for that clarification as well. And has the military done cultural resource surveys for all of the additional acreage included in that withdrawal?
We have not done 100% pedestrian surveys for all of those resources.
So you haven't done 100%, what have you done? 20%, 30%?
We've done 100% pedestrian surveys for the proposed new target areas, and we will continue to expand those based on additional studies and focus areas as we continue to work with tribes in the details of those cultural resource management plans.
Okay, so I have a couple questions on that. Can you share whether any tribe was consulted and whether their use of the land or their cultural resources were considered before the Navy began crafting this proposal, or only after the proposal was developed? In other words, can you please provide me with a basic timeline? And just note that I only have 3 minutes left.
Yes, ma'am. I think what I'd rather do is, rather than try and recall from memory the specific engagements for all of the tribal engagements, if I can take that for the record, I'd be happy to get those details back to you.
Yes, please do that. And while you're doing that, I would like a list of any tribes that have offered written support of the Fallon expansion. Do you know of any right now?
I was just going to say, I think that's a fairly short list because I do not believe there are any local tribes that are supportive of the expansion.
Do you understand why?
I do, ma'am.
Tell me just in a few words.
The predominant reason associated with their objection to the expansion is driven by two things. One is access to cultural resources, and the second one is potential damage or loss of those resources as a result of future training engagements.
Right. And so it's just concerning to me that the Navy could craft their end product proposal, having it essentially ready to come up here, and then call a few conversations with tribal leaders consultation. That's not consultation. It's not just a box you can check. These are sacred homelands and resources for Native Americans who have been on this land long before this was ever a country. You understand that we're on Indian land right now, and every single inch of this country was Indian land long before it was ever the United States of America. They've lived on the land since time immemorial. Their ancestors are buried there, and I hope you understand that as well, that when you have people buried, it becomes hollowed ground. And the idea that this land that's hollowed ground could be used for this type of training it's really sacrilegious in a way to the people whose lives you will affect. So I want to just be sure that you understand that. And I as chair of the subcommittee on national parks, forests, and public lands, I've heard numerous complaints that the military comes to the table with a finished product, then asks for input. And it's not just the military, it's a lot of, departments and agencies in the federal government. It's almost like tribes are an afterthought when they should be a forethought. They should be the first people that anyone thinks of before they decide to do something with the land. So I recognize there are security concerns here, but to the extent practicable, consultation and community engagement has to come first, especially when sacred lands are involved. And I know this may not seem relevant, but there is an assault on sacred sites right now in our country. And I really, as the daughter of a 30-year career Marine, I would like to think that our military has the respect and the ability to be respectful in this way. So I will look forward to to the reports that you will bring to this committee, and I thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Ms. Holland. We're going to a second round. We expect votes soon, at which time we will, shortly after the call of votes, adjourn. In the meantime, Mr. Lamborn? We're going to move to Ms. Torres Small. I think you have another round of questions.
Yes, thank you. I only have one additional question, Mr. Chair. The same question for you, Ms. Miller. Do you have a written list of any tribes that have offered written support of the knitter plan?
So while I don't believe that I have a written list of plans, ma'am, what we have is, as mentioned before, we included the tribal perspectives in its entirety.
And just, are there any tribes that have
LEIS.
offered written support for your
If I can take that one for the record, I don't know the answer to that, ma'am.
Okay, and again, when we talk about meaningful consultation, having a list of who has approved of the plan would be exceptionally helpful in a congressional hearing. Thank you, Ms. Miller. I yield the remainder of my time.
Mr. Lamborn, you had a comment or question?
Yeah, I'm going to ask Mr. Mellon. There was a very heartfelt statement that was just made by Ms. Holland, and her time expired, so I just wanted to see if you had any kind of response that you wanted to share into the record. I want to give you that opportunity.
Thank you, sir. It's not a comment. My only perspective on that is I do know and understand, maybe not understand fully, but I certainly do appreciate your comments. I don't claim to have those kind of deep roots, and I certainly don't claim to have that kind of lineage. But I can tell you the Department of the Navy is committed to doing the absolute best we can to manage and protect those cultural resources to the maximum extent that it is our ability. I can't account for accidents, nor can I account for mishaps that occur as a result. Having said that, I'm also challenged with coming up with potential solutions that meets the Navy needs in order to ensure the readiness of our aviators, sailors, and Marines as they prepare for combat. And finding that balance between the military need, the local and tribal aspects of it is something we strive and continue to work towards. And I'm committed to absolutely continuing to do that.
And as a follow-up, could you talk about the Native American officer who's helping with the planning?
Yes, sir, I will. So I talked earlier, there was some questions. Department of the Navy's initiated the process to hire a full-time tribal liaison on staff at NAS Fallon. In conjunction with that, we're developing a plan and a strategy to work with local tribal leaders to actually bring them in to help us develop the details and updates to our cultural management plan as a part of the expansion. Not just bring them in as part of that, but to actually hire them on to help us manage access and be part of that management access program associated with those cultural and natural resources.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. We have completed this round of questions. Ms. Holland, further questions?
No, Chairman, I don't have any further questions.
Very good. Mr. Amadei? No further. Bishop? Then we have completed our question period here. I want to wrap this up with a couple of my own comments, and that is, this is, for these two ranges, this is the a step in the process for the final determination of what the legislation will be, what restrictions, if any, there will be on it, what land will actually be withdrawn, and how the military will move forward with the concerns of the communities of all kinds around these ranges, including both the environmental, the Native American communities, and counties and states. So we will be conducting continued discussions with the specifically with regard to the Nevada range, both ranges in Nevada, and if in that days ahead, weeks ahead, if concerns are brought to the attention of members of the committee, please bring them to Mr. Lamborn and myself. The two of us will be engaged in those discussions. We welcome the involvement of the full committee and others, representatives from the states involved. What's that? I'm sorry. Oh. You can whisper in my ear, I won't hear. You can poke me and point. Ms. Holland, you have a question.
Thank you, Chairman. I'll absolutely remember that. I wanted to just, I'm looking at this map, and thank you for the map, but it doesn't have any sacred, there's no boundary here for where the sacred sites are, and I think that would be relevant to this discussion. So perhaps you can get with the tribes to look at a map and overlay what they, the sacred sites that they have in the area so that we can see where they are on this map. And that would help us tremendously. And also, Chairman, you may have said this in a way that I just wasn't understanding, but I feel that we need to actually hear from the tribes here. Or have their report in the record or something of that nature.
We would certainly welcome direct input from all interested parties, tribes, other communities, as well as natural resource organizations. And certainly, Ms. Holland, you and other members of the committee are more than welcome and encouraged to continue to participate. I would expect that we will complete this process in the next next 3 months, probably work this into the NDAA if we can do so. That'll be our goal. We look forward to continued input, and we'll certainly continue the negotiations. I'd be happy to hear from members and try to represent their interest, but members can present their own interest as we go through this process. The witnesses, Ms. Miller, and thank you so very much, Mr. Gillis. And the Army got off easy on this one. We'll continue to go through these processes. With that, I believe we will be going to votes, and this committee is adjourned. Thank you.